Welcome to Machiavelli and the Ivory Tower, a videocast series on arms control, non-proliferation, and related international security issues. I'm Sarah Bidgood, director of the East Asia Nonproliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies in Monterey, California.
And I'm Hanna Notte, senior research associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Nonproliferation.
Join us as we discuss cutting-edge research and what it means for real-world decision makers. Whether it's nuclear doctrine, deterrence dynamics, regional challenges, or the state of international regimes, there's just so much to talk about.
And with our guests, we'll break down how their analysis can help us make sense of a complex security landscape.
In each episode, we'll bring Machiavelli into the Ivory Tower.
Thanks for watching. We're glad you're along for the ride.
Welcome to Machiavelli and the Ivory Tower. Our guest today is Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, who is a professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, and he also directs the East Asia Nonproliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. So he's Hannah's and my colleague. You may also know him as the founder of Arms Control Wonk, which is the leading blog and podcast on arms control, nonproliferation, and disarmament issues. Jeffrey, thank you so much for being with us today. It's great to see you.
I'm really excited to do this.
Great. So let's jump right in. In June, you and Aaron Stein co-authored a piece for the outlet War on the Rocks that was entitled, "Who is Deterring Whom? The Place of Nuclear Weapons in Modern War." And if you haven't read it, I recommend that you check it out. In this piece, you talk about the United States and Russia as kind of edging onto what you call the curved slope toward nuclear war. But in the 6 months since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is kind of where we are now, it seems to me like the perceived risk of tumbling down that slope is no longer really front and center in either the media or in the public discourse. And so I'm curious to hear, first and foremost, if you think my characterization of this shift is correct, and then if so, what you think we can attribute that to.
Well, I do think the characterization is correct. And honestly, it's a little bit baffling to me. I mean, we are in a situation where we're engaged in a proxy war with another nuclear armed state. The Russians seem to think that this is extremely important to their security. So the stakes are very high. There's an enormous amount of violence. I think that, there have been nuclear threats is too strong of a word, but definitely, particularly Putin has enjoyed at least invoking the possibility of nuclear war. I think that the real fear of nuclear war has restrained both the United States and Russia in really important ways. And so in so many ways, this is like a classic Cold War crisis, where if we were living through it in the 1960s or 1970s, we would be focused on the possibility that this could all go wrong and that there was a nuclear war. And we would be very upfront about the risks of things getting out of control. And we would be very we would have a lot of candor about how that's constraining us. And none of that seems to be happening. I mean, when President Biden said, well, we're talking about World War III, like that's kind of a case where somebody was direct. But by and large, we see all of these proposals for different kinds of escalation, like a no-fly zone, which, by the way, is a terrible euphemism for an air war against Russia, but okay. And yet there's almost no awareness that escalation is a real thing. The only time that deterrence comes up is when people say, like, well, we're deterred, but how come Putin isn't? Sort of ignoring the fact that, as Aaron and I argue in the piece, that, yes, there's deterrence on both sides. So I just am so struck by how different the way we're talking about escalation risks in this crisis is from the way we talked in the past. And I think, as I sit back and wonder about it, my best guess is there is this kind of post-Cold War hangover. I think we're so used to, in the United States, being war is something that happens someplace else, right? War is a thing we go do in another place, but it's other people who suffer. So I think this idea that a war abroad could somehow ultimately engulf our country is just so counterintuitive, and it's so against the way that we have thought about threats and violence since the end of the Cold War, that I think it feels unreal to people. And then I would say one other thing, which is I have a long-running critique of our own debates in the United States, which is that they're very performative. My sense is that a lot of people in these debates are saying the thing that they think makes them look tough or is going to make them popular or get them promoted. And I feel like they don't really take the consequences seriously. And so there's an enormous benefit to being the person who's so tough that they're not afraid of nuclear escalation. But you can only really engage in that performative behavior if you don't believe that there's any risk at all. And so if you do think that there's risk, which I do, then that seems, like very irresponsible, but also like par for the course for a lot of people.
Yeah, this is super interesting. And, I want to pick up on this idea of there being a debate, because I think that that's something really important in the policymaking space and in multilateral diplomacy in particular. So, I just came back from the NPT review conference, which is happening right now in New York. And as we know, there is this really kind of deep and I would say deepening divide between, some states who subscribe to the logic of deterrence and think that that's really important, and then other states who believe that, deterrence is not reliable. It's eventually going to fail. And that when it does, it's going to have these really catastrophic consequences. And so, putting you a little bit on the spot here, but and recognizing that the war in Ukraine is, unfortunately, probably very far from over, I wonder what you have observed so far that would help you identify which side of that debate may or may not be correct.
Why? One thing we try to do in the piece is to point out that the structuring of this debate into sides is very artificial, because deterrence doesn't function without the realistic possibility that everything is going to go wrong. And the whole idea of the functioning of deterrence is that the risk simplifies calculations, that even the dumbest, clumsiest policymaker is going to realize that there is an inherent risk involved with nuclear weapons, and that is going to make it so easy to understand why one has to act with restraint. And that doesn't work if everyone is hyper-rational and making great decisions all the time, because you could just talk yourself into nothing ever escalating. And in fact, there's a hilariously bad Chris Ford authored thing when he was at the State Department, where there was a discussion of whether if the US were to launch low-yield nuclear weapons at Russia, the State Department's like, well, it wouldn't be rational for the Russians to retaliate, as though like this was some kind of like seminar. It's like, well, that's A, not how real people make decisions, but B, like essential to the functioning of deterrence is the fact that you are afraid that you can't control it. You are afraid that you don't know where the line is, and that therefore that induces caution. And so I think when you look at it like that, it ceases to be this issue of sides, and you just have to be clearer about the decision we're making, right? We have decided that we're no good at getting along, that settling our disputes with something other than lots and lots of violence is just not for us. We can't figure it out. It's too hard. It's the kind of thing hippies do. And so our solution is to base our security on the threat of cataclysmic disaster, right? So when you think of it that way, then I think it's very straightforward. We do get a deterrent benefit in the near term, right? Deterrence probably works. It definitely simplifies calculations. It definitely causes policymakers to act with more restraint, and that's good. But it will eventually fail. Like it just will. And if there's no chance that it will ever fail, then it will stop working, because there's no chance it will fail. And so why would you be deterred? Because it would be irrational to do this. And so I think if we're honest about the bargain we're making, we don't know what to do other than this thing of deterrence. And we know that we can't do it forever, but we can't come up with a better idea in the next 10 or 50 or 100 years. And then, the only interesting question is, how long does your luck hold? right? And what do you use the time that you've been given yourself by creating the system of deterrence? How do you use that to transition to some other system? And so, I guess I'm quite comfortable saying deterrence works, that it has enormous upsides, that I understand why we do it. I understand why other countries do it, while at the same time stepping back and saying like, oh, by the way, also, like, we can't do this forever. And like, we certainly can't do it for 1,000 years. And we probably shouldn't do it for 100.
That's super interesting. And I want to come in here because what you just talked about was sort of nuclear deterrence in a bilateral constellation. That's what the piece was about, looking at the Russia-NATO or Russia-US constellation. Now, China is greatly complicating this picture. Last summer, you and your team revealed work underway at over 100 missile silos for ICBMs in China's Western Desert, which at the time you argued was indicative of China's effort to expand its nuclear forces. And here we are a year later, and on the back of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with the chief of US Strategic Command, Admiral Richard, saying a couple of weeks ago, I think, that the US was now furiously rewriting deterrence, because the US never in the past faced two nuclear capable peer competitors or opponents, which have to be deterred differently. So I want to ask you, in this new strategic environment that the United States finds itself in, where do you see room, if any, for the US to engage China on nuclear arms control, risk reduction, or at least some behavioral rules on the cyber nuclear nexus or on space going forwards? So where are we headed in this more complicated deterrence constellation?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that the commander of US Strategic Command is, he wears two hats. On the one hand, he has the interest of the country to look out for, and I believe he takes that responsibility very seriously. On the other hand, he also cares a lot about his budget. And I think Admiral Richard in particular has been very direct that he sees his role as being an advocate for the role of nuclear weapons in US security policy. And he has been quite clear that he's advocating for more resources. So, I don't think that that's unusual or shocking. I mean, that's what bureaucrats do. But, from an academic perspective, I think we could sort of step back and say that, maybe he makes some good points, now and again, but, he definitely has a point of view, which maybe perhaps precedes some of the factual information. Having said that, I mean, it is an unusual situation to be contemplating two simultaneous arms races, one against a country that, at least in numbers, in the case of Russia, is a peer competitor. And in the case of China, although their numbers aren't the same as the US, right, their economy is enormous. And so their numbers could be the same. And I think if you have a view that deterrence is very complex, if you think that it depends a lot on the details and that you need lots of different types of nuclear weapons and you have to pay very careful attention to how the types you have match up to the types they have, then I think that's a recipe for a really intense arms race, because I think it's very hard to do it against two countries that pose different challenges in different ways. Happily, I am not one of those people. I buy the argument that deterrence is valuable, but I buy the argument it's valuable because I think it is a simplifying fact. It induces caution because you're terrified everything's going to go wrong. I don't think a US president or a Russian president or a Chinese president is ever going to look at a force exchange calculation to decide what risk they want to run. If we think about the crises that unfolded over Berlin, those were crises that were about will and resolve and kind of unknowable, squishy things. They weren't really about hard numbers. So I tend to think that to the extent that you can deter an opponent, and there's no guarantees in life. And again, if there were guarantees, it wouldn't work. But to the extent you can deter an opponent, it really happens at the existential level. And so your first bomb, you get a lot of deterrence with that, right? Your second bomb, you get a lot more deterrence, but not quite as much as you got with the first one. And then I think it levels off pretty quickly. So, I know that there is going to be this argument that we're going to need to have more of every single kind of system that the Russians and or the Chinese have, and that, we need one for the Russians and one for the Chinese. And like, I'm familiar with that kind of argumentation, and I'm sure that that's exactly what a commander of strategic command who wants a lot of money for nuclear weapons is going to say. But when I think about deterrence, I really think about nuclear weapons as providing a basic level of fear, and then the details after that don't matter too much. So I don't think we have to spend that kind of money. I don't think we have to engage in that kind of arms race to get the deterrence we need. But like, on the other hand, it's going to make some people fantastically wealthy, so we'll probably do it anyway.
That's great. Sticking with the theme of deterrence, but moving to another region, I'd like to talk about Iran a little bit. Now, Sarah has mentioned the NPT RevCon that's wrapping up this week. The other major multilateral negotiation that appears to be wrapping up relates to efforts to restore the JCPOA. And there's been a lot of buzz in recent days, in particular, that an agreement might be imminent, including over contentious issues such as the IAEA's ongoing safeguards program to past Iranian activities. But then there is also a lot of concern that a restored JCPOA would not lead us back to Iran's original breakout time as per the original JCPOA standard, given the knowledge that the Iranians have accumulated over recent years. So how do you think, what approaches towards the Iranian nuclear program do you think are required in the future, not just in terms of thinking about different breakout times, but also deterring weaponization?
Well, the first thing I would say is I think I might be wrong about this one, because I was extremely skeptical that the Iranians were going to come back into the agreement after about midsummer, just because the Biden administration had shown such tepid enthusiasm for the agreement. And if you're the Iranians, you have to know as soon as we have like a President DeSantis, the deal's dead again. And so I'm shocked that they're coming back, that there is a political constituency in Iran to come back for more, but I'm like totally delighted if they do. So I have to say, I'm someone who has been consistently skeptical that the Iranians would come back into the agreement, given the way the US behaved. I want to make clear that I think that that's driven by decisions Trump folks made, and that there are consequences to actions. And I'm pleasantly surprised that this is still a possibility. If the Iranians do come back, I have to say, I have always hated the idea of breakout time as a way to assess the value of this agreement. I wrote, many articles bemoaning during the Obama administration the decision to make this a choice, because the way I look at it is breakout time is the one scenario that makes no sense for the Iranians, because it's a situation in which the Iranians announce, we are building a nuclear weapon. You have X number of days to bomb us. And then they proceed to use dedicated facilities in order to do that. And so those facilities are like going to get bombed. In the past, what we saw with the Iranians is when there was a political constituency in Iran for a nuclear weapons program, they tried to do that in secret, right? So there was Lavazan Shian in Tehran. There was the initial decision not to disclose Natanz. There is the construction of the plant at Fordo. Sort of over and over and over again, when the Iranians have decided that maybe they want to either build a nuclear weapon or just give themselves that option, they have chosen to sneak out of their non-proliferation commitments rather than break out. And, to me, that makes more sense, because why would you go ahead and invite an attack? Indeed, one of the strangest things is the way people have reacted to the atomic archive, which, while yes, indicates that Iran had a nuclear weapons program until 2003, which is like not something that should shock anyone. It also indicated that they planned to maintain opacity, that the intention was to build a small arsenal and maybe not tell anyone about it unless they really felt they had to. So to my mind, the problem is always going to be not breakout, but it's going to be the problem of covert facilities. And if you think the problem is covert facilities, then it changes what you want to achieve in the deal. The first thing I think you want to achieve is, and like this is always very popular in the United States, but the agreement has to actually work for the Iranians. It has to create a group of people in Iran who benefit from the agreement and therefore have a vested interest in defending it internally against the people who want to build a bomb. So like the Iranians have to get something out of the deal. And in the US, right, we're constantly critical of that. You hear the kind of nonsense about pallets of cash being flown to Iran. Like, yes, they have to get something out of it. There has to be something in the deal for them, for there to be anybody who's willing to stick their neck out and say that they should stick with it. So to me, that's sanctions relief, that's access for particularly the nuclear scientists to international collaboration, that's the use of nuclear energy, just all the things to create a group of people in Iran who have something to lose if Iran builds a bomb. And then the second piece is better IAEA access. So I am someone who thought that the most important part of the JCPOA was the fact that not only did Iran agree to adhere to the additional protocol, but that it took a series of steps beyond the additional protocol, providing extra access to the workshops where centrifuge components are built, and also uranium mines. And I tried to make this argument till I was blue in the face. I tried to convince Japanese and European officials to like accept the same level of safeguards on Japanese and Urenco facilities, so the Iranians aren't being singled out, so that like these extraordinary measures of transparency become the new norm. Like everybody should abide by JCPOA-like provisions. And everyone's like, I don't want to do it. It's too expensive. It's too intrusive. But to me, that was the real benefit. So if a revised JCPOA creates a constituency in Iran for not building a nuclear weapon, and if it restores IAEA access in those relatively extraordinary ways, I would do it not just even if breakout time is 0, but especially if breakout time is 0, because it's going to be basically 0 one way or the other over time. And so like, why try to fix the problem you can't when you can fix the more realistic problem that you're facing?
Thanks for that, Jeffrey. We've just spoken about verification, and I want to come to a slightly different problem related to that. Now, it seems to me that a fundamental tenet of arms control for the longest time has been that science can be trusted, meaning that when we talk about the verification of treaty compliance, we think that there's information that can be gathered to do that, that is credible and verifiable. Yet in recent years, we've had a lot of disinformation in our space. If we think about Russian disinformation on biolabs in Ukraine, or in recent years on chemical weapons used in Syria, to give just 2 examples, which seem to challenge this fundamental tenet. And it seems to me that that could pose a big problem to the future of arms control treaties and trust in them. Now, you do a lot of work on satellite imagery, open source intelligence, and a lot of cutting edge stuff is happening in that space. How can that kind of work help mitigate the problem posed by disinformation?
The first thing I would say is that disinformation is a really old problem. I am not sure that there is more disinformation today. My hypothesis is that we're more aware of it. So I kind of like Soviet disinformation is like one of my favorite things. So I don't know if you know the story of OTRAG, which was this private German space launch firm that set up in Zaire to try to do commercial space launches in the 70s, which is a really wild.
So please share the story.
Yeah, I love OTRAG. The Soviets engage in this enormous campaign of disinformation about OTRAG, which ultimately they used to justify, I believe it's an Angolan invasion of a part of Zaire. And it puts enormous political pressure on the French, who then lean on the Germans. And so the French lean on on Mobutu in Zaire to throw them out. And they also lean on the Germans to shut them down. And it eventually they do, right? They shut them down. And I actually don't think OTRAG, when it was in Zaire, was a secret rocket program. But then in desperation, they go to Libya, where it is absolutely a secret missile program, right? the point is, like, reputable Washington journalists were repeating that disinformation. There's one fella I'm pretty sure was maybe even on the payroll for the Soviets. And so these kinds of things, the amount of disinformation, I think, has always been extremely high. One reason I think we're more aware of it today is because it's easier to fact check. And so I kind of have this sneaking suspicion that things seem worse today, because back in the old days, if somebody told you that OTRAG was a secret Nazi rearmament thing, you'd be like, I don't know. And they'd be like, well, here's this magazine, here's this issue here, or here's this article in Penthouse, which, by the way, is where it was actually published. And you're like, I only read it for the articles, but you'd be like, I guess, right? It's a real journalist with a real article. Maybe you're right. Today, you're going to have so much more information, right? That you're going to be able to see through that stuff. So I think of like MH17 as being a pretty good example, where, in the old days, I think it would be very hard to tell whether the Russians were telling the truth or not about who shot the aircraft down. Today, it's like, if you really made like any effort at all, like you would know. Right? So I think what's happening is, in the old days, it was easy to say like, well, reasonable people can disagree. And today we're like, no, actually they can't. And you realize like how many of your fellow human beings are profoundly unreasonable. And I think that's disorienting and it's upsetting. So having said that, like in terms of like, what does that mean for arms control? Arms control was always founded on the idea that you would strike agreements that could be verified. So, for example, early arms control treaties don't count nuclear weapons, they count silos. And you only start counting actual warhead loadings recently when you have the inspections that you need in order to be able to do that kind of work. So I think that, we live in an era today where there is so much more data available to the government, but also to those of us on the outside, that I think we can much more easily imagine robust verification schemes than we could in the past. And the open source piece, like even though you wouldn't necessarily design an arms control regime around the open source work we do, I think the open source work we do is very indicative of how things have changed in a positive way, which is to say there's a ton of data out there. We used commercial satellite imagery plus Google Maps to spot the early stage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because as soon as the Russian tanks got on the road, the Russians put up roadblocks so civilians wouldn't get run over on the Russian side. Well, when they did that, the civilians are all carrying phones, and their phones noticed that the road was suddenly impassable. So if you imagine that we now live in this world that everything is recorded, right? Our patterns of life are constantly being recorded on our phones. We're just in a data-rich environment. You can imagine, I think, a lot of new things we could do that would make it much easier to implement government-level monitoring of arms control agreements. And then because we have this robust public debate, you're in a position where you can explain how those agreements work to people, and they're likely to understand them. So on the technical side, like I'm actually really enthusiastic about the era we live in. It's just the fact that everybody seems to have gone crazy and is really excited about having a new arms race that bums me out. But I think I think we lack the political will. Technically, if you took the future back to like, say, 1988 or something, and you showed Roald Sagdev and the other people around Gorbachev, like all the stuff we were going to be able to do, they would be psyched, and then you'd have to like bum them out by saying like, actually, no, it sucks. You're going to want to die before this happens.
Jeffrey, I have to go back.
More optimistic than me, but go ahead, Sarah. Yes.
Yeah, this is a little bit of I suppose a non sequitur, because I want to go back to an earlier part of our conversation before I ask you our final question. But I feel like one of the things that we've been touching on obliquely is the role of individuals in all of this. So, for example, we're talking about in the context of deterrence, different people perceive risk differently. Different people have different risk tolerances. And of course, if part of what we're trying to do in this series is talk about the relationship between the academic literature and policymaking, there is this very robust academic debate about, the third image and the first image. So I wonder, if you can tell us your perspective on sort of who is the winner in that discussion based on the work that you do.
Well, it has nothing to do with the work I do and everything to do with like my dissertation advisor and I'm on a team. Like there's just I can't escape this, right? John Steinbrunner was my dissertation advisor, and his dissertation was called The Mind and Milieu of the Policymaker. So I am someone who has always put decision making at in the front of my analysis. And I like the other people on my committee, I had like Tom Schelling, who was really interested in how decision makers decide, not really in how states act, and Mac Dessler, who wrote like the book on bureaucracy, and then I worked for Mort Halprin, who literally wrote the book Bureaucracy and Foreign Policy. So my fundamental outlook is that governments are just processes for aggregating preferences. Those preferences might be public opinion, they might be the narrow interests of particularly powerful interest groups, and they might be the preferences of individuals competing in a policy space. But the only significant arguments I ever saw between John and Tom and Mac and Mort and Mac and others were about how we model that. Do we imagine that policymakers are pretty rational? Do we imagine that they have to simplify a lot? Do we imagine that they're just freaking out of their mind because most of the time they're not subject matter experts? So there are, I think, really interesting questions about what the right level of abstraction is and what the right inputs are. But, at the end of the day, like also, I lived like 15 years in Washington, right? So my perspective, in addition to listening to my kids scream, is fundamentally that like the people making the decisions matter. And, I think we all know that intuitively. Like we vote, right? We think that picking Donald Trump over Joe Biden is going to be consequential. Like if you believe that, then I think you have to think that the individuals in the process have some influence.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think leaves some people unsatisfied who are looking for a policy solution to something that is fundamentally a human solution. But it's a debate that goes on and that I see, playing out across different sectors.
Well, this goes back to my argument about deterrence being extremely robust, or at the very least, the marginal return to additional weapons being quite low, right? That you get all your deterrence with a relatively small arsenal right off the bat. And that's because I'm thinking about like how actual policymakers react to these things, right? They don't actually do the math. They don't, this isn't a complicated 9-level chess game. It's a pretty simple person who's not a full-time nuclear person making pretty weighty decisions. And so it makes sense that our models for that should be relatively crude, because that's kind of what those people are like.
Yeah.
You've talked to a real politician, right? Like they're not that smart.
Right. So for our
they're
last
not.
Okay.
Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar, so like maybe that's an exception, but like read the transcripts that, stuff he says in meetings is not that clever.
Yeah, I just spent the morning reading the transcripts of the White House Nixon tapes, so I'm right there with you. I
actually play those in class though for that very purpose, is that people imagine these debates are wise and sober and careful. And like half the time, Nixon is drunk and a bully. Like that's the real life. He was a bully, and that affects how they talk and decide.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jeffrey, this has been so great. I want to ask you one final question before we kind of bring it to a close here. As you know, a major focus of this videocast series is really about drawing these connections between scholarship and policy and understanding what the implications are for both. Since, as we've been hearing, you are somebody whose work, I would say sits really firmly at the nexus of both of those communities. I'd love to hear what you think, they can learn from one another. And going beyond that, kind of what approaches have you found to be particularly effective for communicating findings from one community to another, or perhaps counterproductive for that purpose, particularly just to bring it home in the context of a crisis like what we're seeing with Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
I do think that there are a lot of people working in that nexus. And so I think that there's right now a pretty healthy exchange. So nothing I say I would want to feel like I'm being critical, because one interesting thing is that the Biden administration has brought in a lot of academics, and that's a sign that policymakers value academic expertise. It's also a sign that academics care about the thing that they're studying, right? And that they don't feel divorced from it. They want to actually get involved. If I was going to offer a kind of commentary, I would say that we have gotten, I think, a little bit away in our discussion from putting decision-making at the front of our conversation. I mean, I still find that our discussions about big choices, whether those are historical discussions about like what happened or prescriptive discussions about what we should do, they still tend to start from from the perspective of saying like, well, what China's trying to do is. And I understand that as a kind of natural shorthand, and you want to sort of try to be abstract at some level because there's a lot of detail about like politics in China and Russia that we don't really understand. But I think just being much more direct about how much we have, how much the structures that we create for decision making really end up shaping the decisions that end up getting made. And the example I always give, which I think is right, that's probably why I give the example over and over again, is, I mean, I just made fun of politicians for being dumb, but like, imagine you are a governor, okay? So you have to, in a meeting, be an expert on the picks you want for the California Supreme Court, right? So you need to know you really need to understand what the major issues that are likely to be affected by the judicial picks you're going to make are. And then you're going to go to a meeting where you're going to have to discuss police reform, and you're going to have to make equally momentous decisions. And then you're probably going to go to a meeting where you're going to talk about tax policy. Then you probably have a meeting on like housing. And the question is like, how are you supposed to be an expert in all of those different areas? Right? And part of it is staffing. You have to be good at taking staffing. But even then, like, your advisors are likely to disagree. You're going to get different opinions. And so what I think happens is policymakers at the very top tend to have very simple ideas about the world that work across many, many issues. And it's not that they're stupid, it's that they're trying to do as good of a job with nuclear weapons as they're doing with police reform. And that requires a certain level of abstraction and a certain focus on the politics of a thing. And I think sometimes those of us on the outside act like that's dirty or inappropriate. It's national security. How can you be worried about, getting elected again? But I think when we really put ourselves in their shoes, then I think we have a lot of empathy for like what a difficult decision-making process that can be. And I think if we can do that, then I think we can go all the way down the value chain and realize that that's true for the president, That's going to be true for members of Congress. It's going to be true for the Secretary of State. It's going to be true for an undersecretary. It's going to be true for an assistant secretary. All the way down the line, people are going to have a broader range of issues than they can really probably reasonably handle. They're going to have a bunch of pressures, not all of which are purely substantive, and they are going to try to do the best job they can, and they're probably going to suck at it, but if we're honest, probably do a better job than I would.
Well, I think that was quite a wrap. And as you can see over the course of the video, the sun has been fully setting in Berlin. I think we've covered a lot of ground today. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for joining us today on Machiavelli in the Ivory Tower.
No, it's my pleasure.